Hello and welcome, or labas ir sveiki ataveki, as they might say in Lithuania, to this latest in a series of webinars brought to you by the European Institute of Health and Sustainable Development, the EIHSD, whose mission it is to find Europe-wide solutions to healthcare. My name is Joe Lynham and I present the newsroom programme on the BBC World Service as well as the Global News podcast. I hope all of you are keeping well and that you haven't caught this awful virus, which has taken so many thousands of lives on this continent as well as around the world. I hope you get your vaccine into your arms pretty soon. If COVID-19 has taught us one positive thing, it has been to put healthcare at the centre of all our lives. Today we'll discuss migration among healthcare workers to and within Europe. Before the Central and Eastern European nations joined the EU in 2004, there was very little migration of doctors and nurses within the EU. Nowadays, medical professionals in the East are among the biggest sources of healthcare staff in Western Europe. But that, needless to say, causes problems for the countries who lose their doctors and their nurses. So today's debate will hopefully tackle some of these issues with our panel of speakers and our chairman, representing different aspects of today's debate, which is called Healthcare Workforce Policies and Regulation on Global, EU and Member State Levels. We'll be speaking to some of the key thinkers in Europe's healthcare sector about how or whether the industry has the right skills or manpower in the right places to enable the goal of universal healthcare. We'll be discussing how or whether COVID-19 has changed the picture for workers throughout Europe. Now, in a moment, we'll hear from the former EU Health Commissioner Widened, who is now the chair of the EIHSD. After Widened, we'll have two panels. The first panel will feature Matthias Wismar from the European Observatory in Brussels and Professor Annette Schrauven from the University of Amsterdam. Then in the second session, we'll bring you Dominique Polton, who used to work for the National Health Insurance Fund in France. And we'll also hear about healthcare migration from an Austrian perspective with Wolfgang Aulitzky. And then the former Lithuanian Minister for Social Protection and Labour, Algis Dobrovolskas. They'll be discussing how to avoid a brain drain from less well-off member states and how to manage shortages in health professionals. All the biographies and the CVs are a lot of information on that on eihsd.eu. Now, after we've heard from all five experts, we will up to you to put some of your questions to the experts. After almost a year of lockdowns, I'm guessing you're very familiar with how to use Teams and Zoom and to pose your questions on the right-hand side of the screen. So you can get thinking of your questions now. Pose your questions on the right-hand side and you tell us who you'd like to ask the question to. That would help, and what your question is and who you are as well, so I can let the panel know. Now, in order to improve our knowledge, so that we discuss the subjects and topics which are relevant to you, we have a special online questionnaire that we would love all of you to complete during the webinar today. Again, the link for this questionnaire is on the right-hand side of your screen, but it's also on the EIHSD .eu/news website. So the EIHSD website and the news tab, you will see it's not a long questionnaire and you can complete it in a minute. It will give us the results and we will discuss them during the Q&A a little bit near the end of the webinar. So go to the link on the website or click the link on the right hand side of your screen and we'll learn about very important subjects that are relevant to you. So there will be a simultaneous translation in German, French, Russian, Latvian, Polish, and Lithuanian. Obviously, most of us will be speaking in English. So please go to the settings at the bottom of your screen on Teams if you want the subtitles at the bottom of your screen. If you are tweeting or sharing on social media, please use hashtag sustainable development. That's the hashtag sustainable development. So we could all get in a bit of a nice conversation. Everything's on the record. This will be recorded, so try to be nice to everybody. So before we do all of that, I'd like to play a video for you, and hopefully Audrius is ready to play this, refreshing your memories with some of the issues that we discussed in the first webinar in this series by the EIHSD, notably the study from the OECD about healthcare migration patterns. So stay with us. Back in a moment. Start filling out the questionnaire and roll that video there, please, Adrius. Hello and welcome to this very special webcast, courtesy of the European Institute of Health and Sustainable Development, EIHSD, about finding Europe-wide solutions to healthcare.
Health is on fundamental value for humanity. Determinants of health, including properly staffed health systems, are a big issue for Europe and the globe. Most nations committed themselves to the universal health coverage, patient-centered approach, community-based treatment, leaving no one behind. Achievements of all these noble goals is impossible without all appropriate healthcare workforce.
So first element of background is the fact that migration to OECD country and more generally globally has been increasing in the past decades. The total number of immigrants in the OECD increased by almost 50% in the past 15 years. The number of tertiary educated migrants in the OECD increased by 90%, almost double in the past 15 years, from 19 million to 35 million. But at the same time, looking at education policy, we also see a large increase in medical students intake and graduates in many OECD and EU countries. As you can see, about a fourth of all doctors are foreign-born in the OECD, and about a sixth of all nurses. And third observation from this graph is that the number of the share of foreign-born is higher than the share of foreign-trained, meaning that some people get training in the destination country, which could be linked to two different set of issues. One is that country of destination are actually contributing to the training of health workers. But second possibility, which happens in many cases, unfortunately, is that people initially train in their country of origin have actually to retrain because their qualifications are not recognized at destination. And globally, this is a global issue. Overseas development assistance and technical assistance need to be reinforced to help less advanced countries to build up a sufficient health workforce and strengthen their health system and mitigate the factors that are pushing health professionals to leave. You can also bring this last point in the European context and think about improve the system to improve the fairness and the solidarity mechanism the Commissioner was just talking about in order to balance indeed these two objectives, which are free movement. There is no question about trying to limit migration, but also ensuring equal access to healthcare to all.
What are our diagnostic tools to diagnose this shortage, and how should we go forward to get better and not contradicting figures about health workforce shortage? It's absolutely necessary to integrate health accounts or labor accounts in the system of health accounts. There you can see on the right side Germany with the highest figure of national of employment in healthcare in European 27. But the main problem is we have still in Germany a workforce shortage. Health labor shortages are measured regularly by the Public Employment Service. And you can see in this study from the labor offices who reported shortages, you find a lot of countries which are on the top of countries with high employment ratios. Now, a complete contradicting build is given by the global burden of disease approach. In this approach, health workforce shortage does not show any shortage for many European countries. We are still in the beginning of understanding what is really behind that and need to go forward with this practical, empirical research and accounting?
Forecast for 2020-2030 developed by OECD or Eurostat or Department of Statistics shows the population of Lithuania. If these forecasts will be correct, so quite likely the demand of healthcare labor force in Central and Eastern European countries, because Lithuania is just an example, will decrease. And in this case, outflow of medical personnel may be not a brain drain, but a factor reducing brain waste caused by unemployment in the source countries. So this is one scenario of the development, but maybe we can look for more optimistic option. For example, when you're looking to Lithuanian figures on net migration, that means immigration minus immigration, you see that it's true that in 2010 was big outflow, 80,000 of people lost to Lithuania, but it is a reduction by years. And since 19, we have already blue those columns and a positive net migration to Lithuania. And here, based on this assumption that convergence may change migration patterns, two different forecasts. The slow already shown Department of Statistics forecast, which indicates that immigration or net negative migration will continue. This is a forecast done by Health Economic Center commissioned by Lithuanian Ministry of Health, but the average of those two estimates also is quite positive. If so, quite likely we will have much bigger healthcare expenditures, again with a combination of those two forecasts, a stronger demand for health labor workforce, and that's why probably different outlook for migration of doctors from Lithuania as well as other countries. And now for conclusions. Countries of New Europe may gradually transform themselves from donors to recipients of workforce from third countries. Motive of this West migration in between EU countries from search for higher salary abroad may converge with those common to Western Europe. And the last question, should we talk about old and new Europe 15 years after the enlargement?
So in the context of health workforce reforms, medical deserts are characterized by falling number of medical practitioners, inadequate composition of healthcare professionals teams to serve the local population's needs, and little or no access to digital technologies that could actually support healthcare provision. Because most medical desert, let's face it, they're not just isolated and depopulated areas devoid of medical services, they often also lack access to other essential public services, such as education facilities, public transportation. There's often underinvestment in economic activity, so there's high unemployment, greater economic vulnerability. We're not going to criticize individuals, migrant health workers, for their wish and their desire to move abroad, but we need to recognize as a union that this mobility, when it is excessive and when it is skewed, it has unintended and unwanted consequences. So the health labor market is not a free market in the purely economic sense, and we really have to abandon the idea, that idea, and treat it differently.
COVID shows that we need to think how it is important once again to find mechanisms which can strengthen our solidarity. Healthcare workforce, shortages on the ground require much more efforts to develop more complex multi-level mechanisms, but also keeping in mind solidarity and social fairness and equality. Without those mechanisms, we have no chance to encourage people to believe into into European Union project, because health is very close to people's hearts. And here we can move forward with our debates and thinking about pan-European solutions.
Well, there we go. And thank you very much to all the participants last time, especially that guy at the very end there, Vytenis, who is the guy that we're going to turn to again, the former Health Commissioner Dr. Vytenis Andriukaitis for his presentation about the legal avenues to address the unequal distribution of healthcare workforce capacities in Europe. Vytenis, if you want to unmute your mic, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Like-minded friends, ladies and gentlemen. Growing international migration of medical professionals is a global phenomenon. Europe demonstrates even faster integration and growth of labor mobility. Just 30 years ago, the continent was strictly divided with almost no movement of people between the East and West, hostile to each other. Collapse of Soviet regimes and enlargement of the EU eastwards widened the labor market and created new opportunities for Europeans to decide on their employment perspectives. International immigration of medical professionals was also enriched by the destruction of the Iron Curtain. The opening of the East brought gains as well as losses. Depression of the 90s crippled health infrastructure in the Central and Eastern Europe and pushed thousands of doctors and nurses to the West, with many of new migrants taking positions not requiring skills they have, unfortunately. Even today, some countries to the east of the EU, for example, Moldova or Ukraine, are not capable to lift themselves from the misery of the ill-managed transformation. Growth of international migration and mobility of medical professionals in the EU is a development that provides benefits, but at the same time, it is not immune to risks. The free movement of people is cornerstone of an open and integrated EU and has to be cherished. Immigration of highly educated workers places a strain on countries of origin. This hampers the ability of sending states to deliver on the human rights to health while fueling nationalistic sentiment and eroding a vision of European solidarity. International migration of workers is regulated by ILO Convention concerning migration of employment. The convention is emphasizing a rise of immigrants by a statement, I quote, "Each member for which this convention is in force undertakes to apply, without discrimination in respect of nationality, race, religion, or sex, to immigrants lawfully within its territory, treatment no less favorable than that which it applies to its own nationals." The EU goes much further by enshrining free movement of workers in European treaties. The Article 45 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the EU states, "Freedom of movement for workers shall be secured within the Union." The international community welcomes labor migration. On the other hand, it sees risks related to unchecked labor flows. WHO Global Code of Practice on the International Recruitment of Health Personnel, approved in 2010, is calling for the need to balance interests of all parties. The first objective of the code is to establish and promote voluntary, may I draw attention, voluntary principles and practices for the ethical international recruitment of health personnel, taking into account the rights, obligations, and expectations of source countries, destination countries, and migrant health personnel. Article 5 of the code says that the health system of both source and destination countries should derive benefits from the international migration of health personnel. By signing the code, the EU member states express the political will to cooperate both globally and within the bloc in a search of the optimal configuration of health workforce management. At the same time, the code presents the European Union with a paradox. The EU and its members are clearly committed to the code's principles outside the EU, but in the EU, free mobility is legally binding and may not be hindered by governments or other actors. Legally speaking, mobility takes precedence over the code within the EU. On the other hand, the political preference of the EU for free movement does not undermine responsibilities undertaken by signing the WHO code, as well as pledges to work for universal health coverage. Universal health coverage is not achievable if healthcare workforce shortages are not tackled all over Europe. Questioning how to strike a balance between strengths and weakness of migration and mobility of medical professionals and to assure optimal allocation of health personnel in member states is fundamental for global, European and national health policies. The question may be rephrased in the following manner. How to assure that the health system of both source and destination countries should derive benefits from the international migration of health personnel? First question. Second, how to assure equilibrium between freedom of movement for healthcare workforce and such objectives of the EU as cohesion between regions, acceptability of services and universal health coverage for all Europeans? What are legal avenues to address the unequal distribution of health workforce capacities in Europe, providing support to regions that have difficulties in attracting health workers, as well as promoting training and education of health professionals to common standards, coupled with measures to safeguard the rights of health workers from the rest of the world? I am inviting distinguished speakers to address those delicate questions. The WHO Global Code of Practice celebrated its 10 years anniversary in 2020. Let us start with the reflection on the legacy of these very important documents. The first speaker is Matthias Wismar from WHO Observatory. He will concentrate on global and European health policy 10 years since approval of WHO Global Code of Practice and international recruitment of health personnel. Thank you, Matthias. I think that Matthias will start. Thank you, John.
Thank you very much, Vytenis. And Matthias, I can see your first slide. If you could unmute yourself, please, Matthias. Dr. Matthias Wismar from the European Observatory for Health Systems and Policy is going to join us. And as Vytenis says, he's going to look at the 10 years of the policy since then. If you can hear us and you can unmute yourself, Matthias, you can crack on.
I can hear you and I'm unmuted. Joe, thank you so much for this very kind introduction. Thank you, Vytenis, for announcing my presentation. I will look at health professional mobility and migration in Europe through the lens of the WHO Global Code. And most of you have already heard from Christoph and Vytenis. One of the key features of this code is to avoid recruitment of health personnel from countries which have health workforce shortages. And I put a map on my slide here. You can see the dark orange countries, in particular in Africa, but also in Asia and in Latin America. These are countries from which we should not recruit health workforce. Having said that, this is a commitment all WHO member states have meant. The WHO Global Code is much more comprehensive because it includes actually an agenda for health workforce development in countries. And I will come back to this a little later. So after talking about the usefulness of this global WHO code, I will give you a couple of spotlights of mobility and migration in Europe. I will discuss some of the impacts this actually have, and then I will make a little bit of a proposal towards a European health union. What can we actually do better? And just to make you sure, this is based on evidence we published actually together with colleagues from WHO last year, based on data coming from the joint questionnaire of OECD, Eurostat, WHO, Euro. And my colleague Gemma Williams was leading here a mixed team of WHO and Observatory. And we've also been involved over many years in council presidencies with Belgium, Hungary and Malta, helping them on cross-border mobility issues in the health workforce. Now, the first slide is quite busy, and I rather start with what you not see on this slide, because from the 53 countries in the WHO European region, only 28 report on foreign trained medical doctors and 23 on foreign trained nurses. So it's a little bit difficult actually to monitor at the moment mobility for all health professionals across the European region. And if you can see, the slide shows quite clearly that a couple of countries are highly reliant on foreign trained doctors. We have 3 countries that have between 40 to 60% foreign trained medical doctors in their health workforce. 2 countries, 30 to 40, 1 country, 20 to 30, and 6 countries, 10 to 20. And even though the numbers of nurses are lower than this, in absolute terms, they are quite high. And there are also a couple of reporting issues with nurse data. And that is why probably we underestimate a little bit the reliance on foreign trained nurses. Now, this is a very busy slide, but I want to take you through that we better understand the different geographically country patterns in the stock. So in the health workforce at a certain point in time of foreign trained doctors. And we have focused this analysis on 8 case study countries: Austria, Belgium, France, Germany, Ireland, Norway, Switzerland, and the UK, either because they have plenty of doctors, foreign trained doctors in the workforce, or because they have large labor markets which can absorb plenty of people. Please be reminded that was still at the time of the research a year ago, when the UK was still part of the European Union. There was roughly the half of these countries roughly represent half of the European population. So if I start with foreign trained doctor of total stock, you can see again the differences: Austria 6%, what we see Switzerland 34%, Norway 40%. But now the question is, where do they actually come from? How does this overall percentage breaks down? If we look into the EU country, EEA countries and Switzerland, and we've also distinguished between the old and the new countries, then you can see Austria and Belgium heavily rely actually on these countries. So foreign trained doctors from EU countries. Same for Norway and Switzerland. And as I said before, Norway and Switzerland both have very high percentage of foreign trained doctors in their countries. The picture is different if we look into the wider WHO European regions, lower and low middle income countries and upper middle income countries. And there you can see that in particular France, Germany and Ireland are actually relying on doctors outside the European Union. The same is true for the UK actually, which recruits much more outside the European Union than from the inside. Now, this is, again, a complicated slide, but I think things are quite complicated. So these are the 15 top source countries by training of origins. And again, we are talking here about our case study countries: Austria, Belgium, France, Germany, Ireland, Norway, Switzerland, and the UK. And we are comparing the situation between 2009 and 2010 and 2018, the latest available data here. And if you look into the color coding, you see that we have the different EU strata. We have Europe outside the European Union, upper middle and income countries, low and lower middle income countries, and high income countries. And the first lesson we are drawing, there's a lot of recruitment within the European Union. And funnily enough, Germany, which recruits a lot of health professionals, is also sending a lot of health professionals. So the second source countries in this list in 2010. So, but we also see that there are countries from outside the European Union, like, for example, the Russian Federation on number 14, and we have India, Pakistan, Nigeria, and Egypt. And if I remind you of the little map I was showing you in terms of workforce shortages, actually India, Pakistan, and Nigeria at the time were listed as countries with workforce shortages. Now the situation is very dynamic. The mobility is really changing and needs monitored. As you can see, for example, Syria got up on the list from place number 18, clearly because of the civil war. And we have a lot of changes. Also, Romania got up. Poland is a little bit lower now, and other countries are changing as well. So if we are looking into the changes between 2010 and 2018 in terms of the percentage of those source countries in the stock of the 8 case countries, then we can see that India, even though it's still the top source country, has gone down a little bit. And we see that a couple of countries have increased. Romania by 126%. Italy, 98%, Greece, 87%, Syria, of course, 144%, Egypt got up, and Hungary as well. So again, there's a lot of dynamism in this mobility. And I spare you to show the same data on the nurses, because my next slide is really about nurses. And we already heard about Brexit, and actually Brexit is one of these geopolitical events, almost like collapse of the Soviet Union, the accession of the countries, economic and financial crisis, that is changing mobility and migration profoundly, because it has such a large labor market and it relies to a great extent on foreign trained health professionals. And on the left-hand side, in figure 6, you can see the nurses and midwives from EEA countries joining the register for the first time. So you can see that the registration after 15-16, after Brexit decision, is going down rapidly to an unprecedented low level. On the other hand, in figure 7, you can see that the nurses and midwives from EEA countries who left the register is going up. It's more than doubling, actually, after the Brexit decision. But the UK is compensating this. If you look at the figure 9, nurses and midwives from outside the EEA joining the register for the first time, you can see that it is 9-fold increase of those countries. And once in the system, they don't really leave in large numbers. It's rather stable how many nurses are leaving there. Now, having given you a bit of a glimpse on stock data and also on the dynamic of health professional mobility in Europe, we have to take into account that the market is really indifferent. It provides, of course, great opportunities for patient health professionals and health systems, but at the same time, it's also very challenging. And in a publication we've done earlier, like 2 or 3 years ago, we were looking into the pros and cons with regards to efficiency, equity, inefficiency, and equity. And while I don't want to go into much detail into here, there is plenty of pros for the labor market for health systems, but also a lot of difficulties health systems, health professionals, and patients have to face with European integration and the free mobility of workers. But it ain't broken. It needs continuous improvement. It is absolutely necessary. And I would like to make a couple of proposals towards a European health union to emphasize and amplify the positive effects of the European labor market and to mitigate those which are uninvited. And first of all, I think we will hear this throughout the day today. We need to improve health work policies and decrease reliance on foreign trained health professionals. It's a domestic task. Countries need to get their act together and need to see that they recruit as much as possible from their own resources. It will differ from country to country. Some are small, some are poor, and so on. But we need to see that mainly we resource ourselves from our own sources. Second, we really need to improve monitoring. We need to have better country coverage. Only 23 countries out of 53 reported nurse data. We need better inclusion nurses with midwives, reporting on full-time equivalents, understanding how many are really in the system, and of course more timely. I was presenting data from 2018, and we have now 2021, and we have COVID-19. How can we capture actually the movements which are taking place in this crisis? So much more timely monitoring. We also need to have studies on small number asymmetries. I was not referring today to Lithuania, Estonia, Malta, and the small countries, because the numbers in absolute figures seem so small. But in reality, in terms of percentages, but also in the loss of critical skills are very important, and we need to capture this better than just through routine data. So the loss of critical skills and team needs to be really on our radar. And the impact of maldistribution. Are we recruiting people from underserved rural areas, actually, even if overall employment is good? And patient expectations. And last but not least, we need to talk about professional expectations. We were conducting focus group interviews with professionals that moved or returned. And actually, many of those have reported mixed experience in the host country, but also mixed experience coming back. forecasting and planning, we need to do this on the European level. We have a European labor market, but we need to know what's in the training pipeline. What are the workforce policies? Where do we want countries to expand? Where do they want to cut back? And we need to understand the skill mix. From OECD data, we know that many health workers in OECD either feel they are overqualified or underqualified. We know studies that there's a lack in digital health. At the same time, we are allowing all these under or overskilled or misskilled health workers to go to another country to work with under or overskilled workers. So we need to get continuous training, medical in training, professional development really on the agenda Europe-wide, in particular for integrated care, which is more complex, and in particular for digital health. And the last 2 points I want to make, many countries are losing health professionals because they are seeking training slots in other countries they cannot get in their own countries, or they need to wait too long. Romanians get stuck then in France, Germany, or the UK. And what we need to do is to include this into the training schedules of the countries so that a return to the whole home country is actually planned. And there are examples coming from Malta and from the Maltese presidency. And finally, we need to be fair towards health professionals. Very often these are recruited for very unattractive work conditions in the host country with little career opportunities, but we need to see that they are saying that they have the same opportunities as the workers, the domestic workers, and we need to see that they have the same opportunities when they return after a stay at home. Joe, thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me here today. That was my little input on health professional mobility and migration in Europe through the lens of the WHO Global Code. And as I said, it's not a real big problem in Europe that we recruit from the wrong countries, but we are not doing it very well at the moment, and I think we should continuously improve. Thank you so much.
Herzlichen Dank, Matthias. Thank you very much, Matthias Wismar there. Stay with us. Bleiben Sie dran, bitte, Matthias, until the Q&A at the end. Just to remind all of you to fill in the questionnaire, which is available on the EIHSD.EU website, but also you can do it on the right-hand side of your screen. Also, post your questions for the panel. We have already had a question or two, and I will put maybe a question after Annette has spoken. So let me introduce, please, Annette Schrauen. She is Professor of European Integration and Citizenship Law at the University of Amsterdam. Annette will be talking about whether the EU can successfully work towards the balance between securing freedom of movement for workers and addressing the unequal distribution of the healthcare workforce capacities in Europe. Professor Schrauen, it is uw beurt.
Well, thank you very much, Joe, for this nice introduction, and many thanks also to the organizers of this interesting webinar for inviting me to participate. I'm an academic working in the field of free movement law, and the instant reflection I have when I hear that free movement in the European Union causes a disbalance of healthcare workers in the member states is, can, under the current rules, the public health exception be used to justify restrictions of free movement? The answer to that question would be, in theory, it could be used to dissuade people from moving, but not to prohibit them to move. In practice, even measures that dissuade people from moving would be difficult to uphold under the current rules. And let me explain to you why I think that is the case. The European Union is counterintuitive, you might say, to restrict free movement. Treaty provisions, as interpreted by the court, posit free movement as fundamental, which means possibilities to restrict free movement are interpreted as strictly as possible and can never be used to justify restrictions on economic grounds. The focus, thus, is always on taking away barriers to free movement. It is simply the ground rule of the European Union. Furthermore, free movement is seen as an individual right, And a proportionality test of restrictions of free movement very often includes the obligation to look at individual circumstances and the obligation to provide a very detailed analysis of facts. That said, public health protection can be a justification for hindrances to free movement. There are some examples of cases where the court accepted export restrictions based on a public health exception. There is a case in the area of free movement of goods from 2019, where Hungary prohibited pharmacists to supply prescription medicine products to patients who got the prescription from doctors abroad. Now, in fact, this comes down to an export restriction. And in this case, the court accepted that the restriction was in principle justified, because without it, it could result in a shortage of certain medicines for the own population. And the court said these export restrictions were necessary to ensure a sustainable, reliable, high-quality supply of these medicines. Now, I want to emphasize here that the restriction is designed, that this restriction, particular restriction, was designed with only the supply on the national market in mind. One might think that this case, if applied by analogy to free movement of workers, offers a possibility for source states to restrict the number of healthcare professionals moving to another member state, by arguing that it would be necessary to prevent a shortage of healthcare professionals available for the own population. But I must disappoint you, that is not possible. Free movement of workers is different in that respect, in that European legislation has limited the possibility to invoke public health for restrictions of exit. Only in case of diseases with epidemic potential can the right of exit be restricted. Furthermore, there is a provision in the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights that specifically grants every citizen of the Union freedom to seek employment and to work in any member state. So outright restrictions are not possible, but maybe measures that dissuade healthcare professionals to move are. A clear and very relevant example, I think, of how the Court of Justice assesses rules trying to influence free movement for public health reasons can be found in the field of higher education. In the Bressol case, the case where Belgium kept the number of non-resident students to 30% for certain studies. And in some of these studies, some of these medical studies, French students counted at the time for over 80% of the student population. And this was because France knew restricted and selective access to medical studies, and Belgium had not such a restricted access. Now, the defense of Belgium for that cap was based on public health, precisely on the risk of shortage of healthcare professionals, because French students would leave Belgium after their studies, while of course they did receive education that could have been given to a Belgian student. Now, in this case, the court accepted in theory that a shortage of health professionals would cause serious problems for the protection of public health, and that prevention of that risk requires that a sufficient number of graduates establish themselves in Belgium. But then the court turns to proportionality of the restrictions and says this restriction can only be accepted if it is demonstrated by an objective, detailed analysis supported by figures with solid and consistent data. And it must show that there is a genuine risk to public health. In the end, it was for the national judge to assess all the data and the facts, and the national judge determined that there was no risk for public health, so the restrictions were not allowed. Now, this case is also interesting for a remark that the court makes, and that is that maybe Belgium could better impose measures which aim to encourage French students to establish themselves in Belgium at the end of their studies, or which aim to encourage professionals educated outside Belgium to establish themselves within Belgium. So the message here clearly is solve the problems with rules that promote free movement, no rules that block free movement. Another set of cases I think is relevant concern restrictions on patient mobility. And in these cases, member states defended a requirement of prior authorization for treatment in the hospital abroad on public health grounds. And again, ensuring that there is a balanced medical and hospital service open to everybody, while at the same time costs are controlled and there is a prevention of waste of financial and human resources. And again, the court accepts this justification, but adds that in order to refuse authorization, the same or equally effective treatment should be available, but also that all circumstances of each specific case, including the individual circumstances of the patient, had to be taken into consideration. Now, what do these cases learn us on possible measures to reduce immigration within the current EU free movement rules? I could think of two suggestions, but none of these would provide a sustainable solution. The first is, and this refers a bit back to what was said before, access to higher education should be linked to certain conditions, or could maybe link to certain conditions, such as work in the member state where one enjoyed higher education for, let's say, at least 1 year. So conditions aimed at preventing that the member state does not have sufficient healthcare workers in the future, similar to what was said in the Brussels case. But of course, this needs to be demonstrated by an objective, detailed analysis supported by studies, etc. Furthermore, I think it's questionable whether such a general measure that does not take into account the individual circumstances of professional healthcare workers would survive judicial scrutiny by the court. Another measure that might be possible within the current context, but probably only of relevance to small states and islands that suffer from a shortage of certain specific specialists, or maybe for specialist healthcare in remote areas, is an example from Malta. Professional healthcare workers who work in other states, be they Maltese nationals or not, come under the free movement of services to Malta on a temporary basis to offer specialized treatment. And in a Maltese study of 2019, one of these specialists remarked that being a visiting specialist gave him the opportunity to do something back for his country. Now, as you may conclude from these suggestions, I think the current free movement provisions do not offer many possibilities to address a disbalance of healthcare workers in the European Union. I think solutions must be found outside free movement law, in line with the court's suggestions in the Brussels case, to aim at encouraging health professionals to stay and work in the state where they were educated, instead of restricting free movement. I do think that is the way forward, not only because restrictive measures might not stand judicial scrutiny, but also because migration research has shown that restrictions of migration only increase the inherent will to migrate. If I still have some time, I would like to add several remarks based on suggestions made by Iris Goldner-Lang in a recent publication with the title "The Dark Side of Free Movement." Now, in order to develop sustainable healthcare throughout the European Union, it is necessary, she says, to look at a broader picture why people move. Very often we talk about push and pull factors as if it is only a wage difference and the money, but it is not. And if it's not only about money, fiscal measures in themselves will not keep nationals in their home state. What matters more are dissatisfaction with social and political situation in the home state and a lack of public goods such as education for children, future children, housing, availability of infrastructure, leisure activities and social provisions. And all these things matter more than labor conditions and salaries. Another suggestion is to look at measures in higher education and planning of training capacity in the EU as a whole. So to prevent situations, as in the Brussels case, where some member states sort of outsource their expensive medical education to other states. One could also consider the introduction of a solidarity principle that accompanies free movement. And it would entail a fiscal transfer from rich receiving states to source states. So let's say a compensation for higher education, similar to the compensation we have in the transfer system in football. And finally, it would be good to combine local, national, and EU measures. And at the EU level, the cohesion policy seems fit for this aim, because the fact that entire generations of doctors and nurses leave for other member states after they received an expensive education from their home state is directly going against the intention of EU cohesion policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Hartelijk bedankt, Annette, for your contribution. Some very interesting points raised there. I especially like the idea of the football transfer market and paying the small junior club that trained the footballer, that took him on when he or she had no talent or no ability. I think that's a very interesting idea, and I'm sure some of our colleagues on the EIHSD will have some views on that. I want to put a question, if I may, to Vytenis, if he is there. Vytenis, if you could unmute your microphone, I'm going to put a question to you before we move on to Dominique Polton. And the question is from a shy viewer. He or she did not want to give his name, but it is for you, former Commissioner Andriukaitis. How do you foresee the regulation of healthcare worker movement because of the economic differences between so many of the member states? And how ready would you say, and you're no longer in the Commission, but how ready is the EU to tackle this problem given its current capabilities, capacities, or legal constraints? Vytenis, if you could handle that one, unmute your mic, that would be great.
Yes, I'm ready to answer. Thank you. Question is really very important. Now, after Annette's speech and proposals to find some solutions, and especially keeping about football transfer idea, or some idea to have 1 year, to work in country and so on. First of all, let me tell you, now it's time to rethink European Union as such, as a whole. First of all, we need to change our calculations of GDP. Now we need to think, how can we include into GDP human capital issues, employment, social determinants, unemployment rates, and on all issues. We need to go from old GDP formula to new one. Calculating all issues like today were proposed in Green Deal, for example, from European Commission. Why? Because we need now to understand more or less how can we achieve more cohesion between member states. We have no chance to move like today in the future. And now we need to think how can we improve more capacities to achieve cohesion, speaking about human capital, investment in human, because without possibilities to have healthcare workforce in some medical deserts, you have no chance to deliver universal health coverage. You can undermine European Union idea in solidarity and in access to it. Second, of course, we need to think about possibilities to amend Lisbon Treaty. Today's Lisbon Treaty is not capable to deliver issues related to social fairness and social inclusion, and it would be good to amend Article 3 of the Lisbon Treaty. Let us amend Article which starts with the Union shall establish an internal market by one sentence. It shall promote universal health coverage by establishing a health union. And then we will see possibilities to address constitutional asymmetries enshrined in today's Lisbon Treaty, and to think about new instruments, allowing EU to be more social and more cohesive and more comprehensive and more, equally delivered situations, because we know very well differences in economies of member states are so huge. We have no chance to move forward without debates about possibilities to change to improve Lisbon Treaty in this way.
Thank you very much, Achu, Vitanis, for that. Thank you very much. Stay with us, Vitanis, for the Q&A at the end. We'll come back to you. I have a few questions, and the audience, I'm sure, will have a few questions. Just to remind you out there, or to post your questions using the Teams facility, and we will then put the suitable questions to our panel. I'd like to move on to our next topic, please. And so, Dominique, you can unmute yourself. Dominique used to work for the National Health Insurance Fund in France, the Caisse Nationale d'Assurance Malade, or CNAM, and she's going to give us a few words on evidence-based policies in managing national and regional shortages in health professionals. Dominique, après vous.
Thank you very much, Joe. Yes, so I have some slides, but they will be shown immediately. And I'm sorry because I'm disconnected from time to time. If it happens, I will try to join again as quickly as possible.
Of course.
I would like to make a link between the issue of international mobility resulting in inequity between countries and the issue of unequal distribution of health workforce within countries, because all countries to a certain extent are faced with this issue of a geographical distribution of their own health workforce, and all countries are faced with local shortages, either in rural and remote areas or in poor urban areas. And there is a lot of experience on this issue, and I thought it would be interesting maybe first to see what we can learn from it. And if I can have the second slide, please. Thank you. The strategies that have been developed may rely on education, financial incentives, regulation and coercion, or professional and personal support. Of course, they can combine these different policies. Just to give a very brief overview of what we know, what is working and not working in these strategies. First, if we take education, we all know that training more professionals, only doing that, hoping that once the attractive areas are full, the professionals will go in less attractive areas. It doesn't work. We all know that. But it's important to say that if you don't have enough workforce, enough health professionals globally, then the situation will be worse for these areas, because there will be unmet need also in more wealthy areas. So it will be more difficult to have professionals in these underserved areas. So it's important to stress that it's not the solution to train more and more and more professionals, but we have to have the right number of professionals if we want to serve the whole territory. Another strategy is to select students. And it's interesting because there are some positive experience, because the idea is also to have some diversity in medical schools, to attract people who have personal characteristics, who are more likely maybe to work in these underserved areas. And some countries have developed these strategies through, for instance, giving objectives to medical schools to recruit a percentage of students coming from rural areas, for instance, or building campuses, building medical schools in remote areas in order to facilitate this diversity of recruitments. And I think that this is true for the underserved area, that we might also think for the more global picture. We don't have that positive experience for financial incentives. We have mixed results for, bursaries, scholarships for students in exchange for practicing a number of years in underserved areas. But generally, what the general experience is that once they fulfill their contract, they leave these areas. However, what's interesting, and I will come back to that, is that in the experience where there is a lot of support for these students or these new practitioners, where there is a good environment and a positive experience, they tend to stay more than in the general case. There is very little positive experience about financial incentives as a whole to practicing physicians or nurses. The fact is, a lot of research show now that, in fact, when you look at preferences of physicians or other professionals, they value much more other non-monetary aspects of their job, much more than monetary incentives. And it's very interesting that these studies, which we do in experimental economics, have been done in a number of countries, including a lot of European countries, and we always see the same results. That is, these other aspects of the job satisfaction are much more important, especially for new generations of professionals, than really only the incomes. And I think that we have to reflect on that as well. Of course, we have regulation and coercion, but generally you cannot oblige people to stay in a specific place in a designated area, or you can do that only temporarily, that is for a certain period of time. And some countries do that, for instance, for foreign doctors or as a prerequisite to specialize, but it has also perverse effects. And of course, that you can have permanent limitations. In some countries, you have only a limited number of positions or contracts for each geographical area. But yet again, if you don't train enough people altogether, it doesn't prevent you to have shortages in local areas. And for instance, in Norway, we had this problem for a long time. And the last thing which I would like to insist on is that apart from that, we have something which is not we don't have that much evidence, scientific evidence, but obviously there are very positive experience about the fact of creating an environment that increases job satisfaction, that in good working conditions, like facilities to build a network of work. A lot of new generations want to have teamwork and collective projects, facilities for continuing education, local relief, opportunities for research, for instance, and all these aspects of a professional life which increase job satisfaction have proved in certain areas to be very attractive and attractive enough to keep people, to attract people and to keep them in these areas. Now, what can we say? And we will go to the next slide. What is relevant in all these policies? What is relevant for our subject of today, which is from not within countries, but an equal distribution between countries. So what can we learn from that, and what responsibilities and drivers can we see both in receiving countries and donor countries? We can go to the next slide. And I would like to say that for me, the first responsibility, but it has been said already by Matthias, for instance, the first responsibility is really to train enough professionals to meet the national population needs. And I just like to show the example of France on this graph, that the fact that the training capacity implies more or less migration from other countries. We had France has had a typical stop-and-go policy, as you can see on the blue line, which is the number of students admitted to medical school in second year. And we had in the 80s a fair of an excessive number of physicians, and this number of students was dramatically reduced from something like 9,000, but even more, because it wasn't really applied, but let's say 10,000 to 1/3 of that. That is a little more than 3,000 youth students per year at the lowest. And then suddenly instead of having a feeling of having too many physicians, we thought we would lack physicians, and it was again increased very sharply and very, very rapidly to what it is now. Of course, I mean, it is the orange line. With a few years after, you saw the same pattern for the physicians newly registered at the Chamber of Doctors. But what you see also, and is that when this newly registered physicians decreased, the number decreased, you had a very sharp increase in the number of registered physicians with coming trained in other countries. And what I want to show is on the right part of the graph, because yes, we have an increase with the ups and downs, but basically a very sharp increase. But look at the right part of the graph, you see that now that it is increasing again, the number of young physicians registering at the Chamber of Doctors, you see that the percentage of registered doctors trained, graduated in other countries is getting down and down rather quickly. And it's not only the percentage, because we could say that, of course, if it's a percentage, it's normal that it goes down, but it's also in absolute numbers, and it's going down rather rapidly these last years. So it means that, of course, if we train our own doctors, we won't need as many doctors coming from other countries and trained in other countries. They're not only other national doctors, but there are also French doctors who couldn't be trained in France because of the restriction, as Annette shown for the Belgium. The next slide shows that the second responsibility is also to address this issue of local shortages within the country. As I said, I think both are linked. That is, you see here that, of course, the percentage of physicians who are trained in other countries is decreasing, but it's very, very different from one place to another. And where you don't have enough doctors, that is, the density is rather low on the left part of the graph, you see that these territories, which are the départements in France, some of them have a very high percentage of newly registered doctors who are trained in other countries. So it's also a matter of responsibility of each country to try to address this issue of local shortages within the country. And my last slide will just add a few reflections, which is, well, how to strengthen these responsibilities. So the first thing might be to increase public awareness of these issues in each country, because to be honest, in France, we don't have that much public debate about that. It's getting better now, and it begins to be in the public debate, but so far, you know, you needed a physician somewhere coming from abroad. Well, that was like that, and that's it. So probably the fact of having these debates about equity and equity between us in each country is important. There might be, and Annette talked about that, financial compensation, because a lot of these trained doctors in other countries were in fact French, and so we didn't pay for this training, and also this is the case even for those who are not French. But since the fact that if they had been trained in the country, it would have cost money, the idea of financial compensation might be at least fair. It doesn't solve the problem, but it might be fair. My second reflection is that we were saying that, of course, the income is better in Western Europe, and so it's very difficult to retain locally trained medical staff. When you see all this research about preferences of doctors and other professionals, you show that the value attached to non-monetary incentives is very high. And so I think that there is room probably to work on the environment of health professionals and doctors. For instance, Matthias said that. He talked about career opportunities and professional expectations. I think that it has to be worked on in each country to understand what are the aspirations of these professionals and how can we create a good job environment, a satisfactory environment to retain them. And finally, my the last reflection would be around this, but doesn't work perfectly well, but work little, which is financial help for students linked to some sort of service agreement, but together with all these recruitment strategies and support. That is a combined strategy with again making these newly registered practitioners happy to be where they are with a good work environment, and being, of course, supported in their studies as well. It might be also maybe a way to retain more professionals within each country. Thank you.
Merci, Dominique. Merci. Thank you very much. Stay with us for the Q&A at the end. Now to discuss the Austrian experience and how to avoid a brain drain of healthcare talent from east to west. Please welcome Wolfgang Aulitzky from the American Austrian Foundation. The title of his 10-minute presentation is Practical Experience on How to Provide the Needed Professional Qualifications and Avoid Brain Drain from East to West of Europe. Herr Aulitzky, bitte schön.
Danke sehr. Well, thank you. It's not really an Austrian experience, but I am an Austrian and I'm working at Weill Cornell in New York. And it was actually an initiative from 1993 when we established this global postgraduate educational program together with the American Austrian Foundation and initiated with Weill Cornell medicine doctors and the Open Society foundations. This is our mission statement, because at that time we realized major political changes may change Europe. And our mission statement was to improve healthcare in countries of transition. The program should promote brain gain and prevent brain drain. At the same time, providing state-of-the-art postgraduate medical education and training to young, dedicated physicians, empower healthcare professionals, and give them the opportunity to rebuild the healthcare system. And why was this necessary? Well, this has to do with the fall of the Iron Curtain. And it was overlooked that many healthcare systems in Central and Eastern Europe and the newly independent states were near collapse. On top of that, the open borders encouraged people to travel. There was this large exodus of healthcare professionals from Eastern Europe to Western Europe, and, which is also not discussed so far, to the United States. There was literally a move from the East to the west parts of Europe, to the UK, and from there to the United States. On top of that, the political changes in this so-called free area of Europe was very slow. Nepotism and this top-down hierarchy did not change because the old nomenclature was still in place. There are many other reasons why people were leaving their countries. I don't want to go into this detail, but one thing which I think is very important was also overlooked. The existing developmental programs, usually based as a single opportunity, long-term fellowships, research focus, great high-level training, but that automatically led to brain drain. We therefore decided to do something completely different. We offer only short-term fellowships, multiple opportunities. We had a clinical focus from the very beginning, and I would consider this as high-level mentoring. That's at least what we wanted to achieve, and that apparently led to brain gain. So our possible solution is best characterized by this summary. We offer high-level and comprehensive medical educational program for mid-career level English-speaking physicians. We want to show them that they are colleagues and they deserve this kind of training. This should lead to capacity building, but also to empowerment of the local healthcare professionals. It must be fun to practice medicine in your home country. If that is not the case, you will leave. Instead of these long-term fellowships, we offered short-term programs only, but, which is also important, multiple opportunities and long-term mentoring. Whenever our colleagues who are now part of our network, which as I showed at the very beginning is now almost close, it's close to 24,000, they should know there is somebody who can provide help. And it was possible to convince US and EU medical institutions to provide ongoing supports, and the physicians participating in this program, and they come from the best institution around the world, they have to donate their time and their expertise. So we built this pyramid. Step one is dedicated to knowledge transfer through our seminars, and now due to COVID, webinars, which we call ominars. If people succeed, if they basically have a good final test, they become alumni, and they have now access to step 2, OMI observerships for experience exchange. Step 3, capacity building through OMI satellite symposia and visiting professorships which take place in their home countries. and finally, our leadership program. Today, we have 200 to 600 applications for each seminar, where we select 30 to 40 highly qualified English-speaking mid-career level physicians. It's a competitive and open selection process based on merit, and the fellowships cover travel, tuition, teaching materials, and also full board. The seminars include state-of-the-art lectures, case presentations, workshops, hands-on training, pre- and post-seminar tests, but most importantly, it's based on Anglo-Saxon didactics. Learning has to make fun, and therefore we need an interactive format, we need open dialogue, and this in the end creates a community of physicians who are all benefiting from this activity. This is the facility where basically that is the home base in Salzburg. We also created a comfortable environment where fellows and faculty meet for a whole week. And at the end of that week, this group becomes a group of friends. Now, this is a list of our academic partners, and it includes the leading children's hospital of the world from Philadelphia. It's always ranked #1 in the United States. It includes the leading cancer center. It includes the leading orthopedic center. It includes the Cleveland Clinic, which is one of the leading institutions in terms of cardiac surgery. But it also includes the Institut Pasteur, Maastricht University, and all Austrian medical institutions. We offer seminars in all areas of medicine so that everybody finds the responding seminar which he is interested in. And this is a summary of the group photos of the year 2019. And I can assure you, by the end of that week, of that seminar, that group, fellows and faculty, became a group of friends, and we maintain this relationship and friendship through our webpage and our blogs and other activities. We created a global network of physicians, now almost 24,000 from 127 countries. The next step is dedicated to observership and to experience exchange. We offer clinical observerships and also research observerships, but none is longer than 3 months, but it can be repeated 3 times. And these observerships offer now opportunities to learn about clinical skills, new techniques, about hospital management, which is sometimes different in the West and in the East. People can establish personal relationships with the faculty, but it also offers opportunities for scientific and educational opportunities, because in the end, just like now, when people from the East go to the West, we have to manage the people from the West go to the East. But the most important aspect for this is somebody has to be a qualified OMI seminar alumni. The third step is dedicated to capacity building in the country. Every single fellow can invite faculty members from the seminars or mentors from his observerships to his home institution in his home country. The OMI alumni himself has to organize the satellite symposia or the visiting professorship. And this gives him the opportunity to bring international experts to his home institution or her home institution. And this is so important for empowering these people in order to build a career back home. They have to be at the equal level than their Western colleagues, and this gives them the opportunity to show this is what we have achieved over the years. So far, we have organized 268 of these satellite symposia. We cover the expenses of the international faculty and the international travel, but the organization is in the hands of the OMI alumni. On top of that, whatever we offer in terms of education is published electronically on our e-learning basis, and it's basically a handbook online. And since the content is updated at least after 3 years, it's always updated, and it's an ideal continuing medical educational tool, and it is a free source. everybody can look it up on his iPhone, but also on the computer, of course. Now, after 20 years, since this program is now up and running, you can see that 23,000 or almost 24,000 people participate in the seminars. 3,400 fellowships were given out for observerships. I mentioned already 268 satellite symposia, and more than 700 fellows are participating in our OMI leadership program. It is not a master, but close to a master, and we offer whatever they need, and this is offered also through seminars and personal education. Now, does this has an impact? Well, when you look at the percentages of physicians of each country who have participated in our seminar, you will see that 18% of all Albanian physicians, for example, participated in this program, but also more than 13% of all Estonian doctors participated in this program. But when you look at more Central European countries like the Czech Republic, more than 1,000 physicians participated in this program, which is 2.3%. So the program has an impact at the healthcare in these countries, because most of our physicians not only went home, they stayed home. And this can be seen in this slide because we did a very exact evaluation of the Baltic states, because many Baltic doctors moved not only to Germany, but also to Finland, Sweden, and Norway. 97% of Estonian doctors are still practicing in their country, 91 in Latvia and 93 in Lithuania. But also in Slovakia and in North Macedonia, more than 90% of our fellows are still practicing medicine back home. We also asked them, did our program meet their educational needs? The majority said yes, in this case, far more than 90%. We asked them whether the seminars, to a certain extent, improved the professional practices of their colleagues at their workplaces. Again, the majority agreed. And we also asked them whether it helped them to build a professional career. And more than 70% also agreed that this program helped them through contacts with national and international leaders in their field to improve their professional career. So overall, we believe that short-term educational programs focusing on clinical issues, multiple opportunities for participation, and programs tailored to the needs of the participants can help to stem the brain drain, because it really empowers people living in these countries. And the ongoing contacts and this career-long mentoring, not only from the inside, but also from the outside, is empowering physicians and convinces them that there is a chance for them, there is a future for them to build a career in their home countries. This peer-to-peer mentoring must not stop. And under these circumstances, I think that the Open Mega Institute is at least one example that helps to stem the brain drain and helps people to build careers back home. But it's based on knowledge, it's based on experience exchange, but in the end, it adds up and helps to build capacity. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to show what the Open Mega Institute has been doing over the last 25 years, and we will continue doing this. We provide roughly 1,500 fellowships a year, and we hope to be able to continue this rather fruitful, stimulating cooperation with mainly Eastern European physicians and physicians from countries in transition.
Thank you very much. Herzlichen Dank, Wolfgang. Fascinating presentation, I thought. I certainly learned a lot. I wonder who pays for all that. Very quick question for you, Wolfgang, before I move on to Algis. Well, whether the European Union helps subvent some of these very important. No, they don't.
No, the European, well, since professional education is not part of science and also, unfortunately, medicine, We never received any fund from the European Union. We have a matching fund agreement between the Austrian government and the Soros Foundation. €1 is matched by $1. That covers about 40%. We have the Vienna Philharmonic Orchestra, who provide a benefit concert for us every year, which brings in roughly $800,000 every year. And on top of that, there are several other NGOs, individuals. One individual, I need to name him personally, is Pablo Legorreta. He helped to build the second hub in Mexico City for Latin America because the problems are exactly the same. Just the move is more from south to the north.
Yeah.
And we are just now building a program over there. So we have about our program, since we don't have to pay faculty, we do not pay the leader of hematology of Sloan Kettering to give a talk. He comes for a whole week and he has to donate his time. So it is not a very expensive program. Our overall budget is about $4.5 million. And a lot of money goes into travel. And since it's a not-for-profit program, I am working also for free, like all the other physicians. It works, but it's a professionally run organization because, you know, doctors who teach for money, they are second class. They don't have that enthusiasm.
I see a round of applause from Vitanis. It
no,
should
but
be
you
for the
really
love of
have
saving
to.
lives.
Yeah, you have to care for these physicians so that they can provide the necessary help to their patients. You know, this is a humanitarian activity, but at a very high level. We doctors are blessed to do our job. And this is what we are trying to export also to Eastern European physicians. So that's what we're doing.
Well, thank you very much. And I think on behalf of many governments in Central and Eastern Europe, I think they'd be very appreciative of what you do, Wolfgang. Just to remind, I'm going to come to Dr. Algis Dobrovolskas very shortly. He can unmute his mic. Just to remind you to fill in the questionnaire. Now, I know, Audrius, you can put that on the right-hand side of the screen so everyone who's tuned in can fill in our questionnaire so that we in the EIHSD, so that we know what you want to discuss. So we know how to improve and what is relevant and important for you. You can do the questionnaire on the website, eihsd.eu, or Audrius, I think you're bringing it up on screen now so people can click it. And that'll be put together in the background, and we will then post the results on the website a little bit later. Before we open to the Q&A, I want to bring in the former Lithuanian Minister for Social Protection and Labour, Dr. Algis Dobrovolskas, who will be discussing ways to fight shortages of the healthcare workforce, perspective of a social insurance expert. Algis, the floor is yours.
Different influences on the shortages of health workforce. Activities helping to mitigate health workforce shortages on different levels. International organizations and health workforce. ILO, EU, WHO regulations opening gates for free movement of health workers and for deepening of health workers shortages in the sending countries. OECD figures show that shortages of health workforce in general are covered more by migrants than by native resources. Further, we will review activities helping to mitigate health workforce shortages, paying attention on failure to do that. National level. Addressing and implementing of push and pull factors by donor countries. There is wide range of the retention measures, pull factors, improved job satisfaction, pay rates, working conditions, housing and social protection, alike. Authors of Mainstreaming Migration into Development Planning indicated some push factors, for example, social exclusion, lack of opportunities in home countries, and so on. SWOT analysis could be useful identifying and implementing push and pull factors at state and or municipal level. The failures of these push and pull factors could be hard to implement because sending countries often are lower income countries and cannot compete with high income destination countries for health workforce. The pull factors often induce the redistribution of health workforce inside state territory, but not the factor which impede migration. Greater self-sufficiency through increased domestic education and training capacity by receiving countries. This proposal has some shortcomings. For destination countries, there is still cheaper to import than to educate health workforce themselves. In short or medium term, there is limited potential to increase domestic education and training capacity because limited portion of school child with knowledge, for example chemistry, required to start medical education. So, education requires reforms even in secondary education. It may take decades. Countries may orient their educational programs to the graduates' export, not to fill the gaps in domestic markets. The Irish paradox: doctor shortages despite high numbers of domestic and foreign medical graduates, show that increased education, unfortunately, can lead to greater emigration of graduates. Developing selected labor immigration programs to bring in replacement workforce to fill gaps left by departing migrants. The failure is, immigration may create skills shortages in the country from which migrants are drawn. This country quite usually is poorer and potentially more in need of its skilled workers. Returning members of the diaspora can bring valuable skills back with them, whether they return permanently or temporarily. However, migrant returnees can struggle to reintegrate and make the most of the skills and experiences acquired abroad. Policy coherence, i.e. better aligning across the education, employment, health, labor, migration, and finance sectors. Unfortunately, it could be rather complicated and long-term political process. Bilateral-multilateral level. Bilateral-multilateral labor agreements between countries of origin and countries of destination can be substitute or an supplement to the requirements of ILO conventions or EU directives on protection of migrant workers. Mutually beneficial agreements often may be less painless way for donor countries to supplement health force in destination countries and can provide resources from destination to sending countries. Weaknesses of bilateral, multilateral agreements does not necessarily impede migration. Can be hardly implemented for the small countries, for example, Baltic states with limited supply of health workforce, at the same time suffering from health workforce shortages. International level. Having in mind limitations of implementation mentioned measures on national or bilateral multilateral levels, we fully agree with the statement that taxpayers in sending countries have a right to reimbursement for their investment in training health workers who migrate out of the country. Final report of the expert group to the High-Level Commission on Health, Employment and Economic Growth, Richard Horton et al., WHO, 219, p. 39. There are few proposals on compensation for sending countries, resource transfers from destination to sending countries, for example, through investments in the training systems of those countries from which destination countries draw staff. This proposal can be implemented through bilateral or multilateral agreements. This may be complicated, when migrant flows are quite small and bargaining costs are high. Cost sharing or via a global health resource fund to support investments in the health workforce. There is no mechanism for implementation of such proposal. A targeted system of taxation involving ring-fencing tax paid by trained health workers who migrate to high-income countries, and returning a negotiated percentage to the sending country. That may contradict to, a, national taxation systems and b, free movement of labor force. Our proposal on compensation. The EU scheme of compensation for migration. Labor force receiving countries may compensate losses for sending countries in the line of budgeting on the basis of historical data of migration flows from compensation fund. People who migrate between the countries participating in compensation fund will receive transmigration payment to cover part of their expenses of migration. Other means of compensation fund will go to the sending countries. That will encourage a. persons to migrate between the countries participating in compensation fund. B. Other than EU countries to participate in compensation fund.
Excuse me. Achu, Algis, and sorry for muting myself. Stay with us, please, Algis, while we bring back all our distinguished panelists and the chair of the EIHSD. I'm going to put a question that we've got from the audience. It is from Corinna Hinlope from the WeMos Foundation. And we know Corinna, and the smart one of us, the more astute of us, will have recognized her contribution in the video that we played at the start. The question is for her compatriot, Annette Schrauen. And the question, Annette, if you could unmute yourself to get ready, is: could you imagine that a community or an individual from a deprived area where there is not so good healthcare or very few healthcare professionals, that they bring a case to the European Court of Justice to demand their right to access to a healthcare worker? What do you think the court, the European Court of Justice, would say? That's Corinna's question for Annette.
Well, thank you very much, Corinna, for this question. It's an interesting question. In the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the EU, there is a provision that says everybody has access to healthcare and the right to benefit from medical treatment. But it also says, according to the conditions under national law and practices. So I'm afraid that going to the Court of Justice would not help a lot here, because it is not a directly enforceable right. It is sort of a fundamental right, but it is something that member states should strive for. And I think it's also one of the problems we have with healthcare under the EU treaty is that member states do not give competences to the European Union here. They guard their competences. They want to have their own healthcare policies. And that makes it very difficult if free movement provisions lead to disbalances, and it does not give a direct claim to these rights, even though it is in the Charter.
Well,
and I hope this answers the question.
You give a very good, it was a very good question actually from Corinna, and a very good answer as well. Can I ask a question of Matthias, please? Matthias, you can unmute yourself. There has been a strange exodus of workers, not just in healthcare, Matthias, but in many sectors during the COVID-19 crisis. I read that as many as 100,000 people returned to Italy alone during lockdown, and helped, of course, during lockdown. And some estimates say that up to 1 million people may have left the United Kingdom last year. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that, because you said your data is a little bit old. You'd rather real-time data. So you must have thoughts on that, Matthias Wismar.
I do have some thoughts, so I'm not quite sure how much they are corroborated by evidence, but clearly number one is that the pressure on health professionals, and in particular the mental pressure, is immense, and that people, after withstanding these pressures, are sometimes really opting out, can't take it no more. And that is really substantial. We've seen this pressure in terms of extra shifts. We've seen that pressure in terms of exposed to extreme events and unknown or unprecedented sad situations in hospitals. But at the same time, you know, in a Europe where we have a mobile health workforce, we need to acknowledge that they need to look after their own families, you know, after their parents. And I think this is one of the issues why they are actually returning. And then also, you know, in these times of crisis, out of sudden, probably some openings are there that they have opportunities to work in their country of origin. And that is the moment. I remember the time like 4 or 5 years ago when in Germany, in the hospital sector, salaries were upgraded and working conditions improved, and out of a sudden, many health professionals returned to Germany actually again, that originally worked in Switzerland as mobile health workforce. So not entirely conclusive, but I think there are good reasons why people are leaving the sector and leaving the country. And the UK, I think, is a very special case, because in the UK, we heard also reports that out of a sudden people who for a decade felt very, very much welcomed had out of a sudden some second thoughts about their situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthias. I'm going to put the same question, if I may, to Dominique Polton. If you could unmute yourself, Dominique, about the exodus of people last year during the coronavirus crisis, and whether some of those healthcare workers who came back to smaller countries, whether some of them might decide to stay.
Well, it's a good question. I'm not quite sure that I have answers to that, to be honest. So I don't know how to really answer that. I'm sorry.
Oh, don't worry. I could put it on to I could give it to Vitanis if you want. Vitanis, if you could unmute your microphone, and maybe you've got some thoughts on that about the returning emigres, for the want of a better phrase. So many thousands of people left countries during the COVID-19 lockdowns.
No, I also have no answer, only my personal view, because first of all, please keep in mind human factor. Of course, we all know that some people are very keen to help their relatives and so on, and language and so on. And they understand very well the situation in their countries, and they may it might be cumulative moment to also from ethical point of view to come back and to see and to how can help, because the notion was that all healthcare systems are in danger. They are overcrowded. Some healthcare systems are under collapse and so on. It motivates people to to come back to come back to home and so to help, because it's solidarity. It's very human from my point of view. Speaking about the situation in the beginning of COVID crisis and the beginning of very big challenges related to our healthcare systems. But because it's not about economic factors, it's very difficult to explain, not keeping in mind human, cultural, behavioral, human, humanistic, more or less approach, ethical approach. I think this might be.
Maybe
Dominique, you want to get in there, Dominique?
Yes, if I can just add a very small reflection, because I don't know what will be the future, but it seems to me that this crisis is changing a lot of things in the way people think about their lives, think about their future, the way they want to organize their. So I think that we're probably at the beginning of something which may be new in terms of patterns of mobility. It's difficult to say what it's going to be, but it's quite clear that in all countries it makes people think about what they would like to do and maybe do something differently than before. It's not only the world after or before, but it's quite clear that there might be a shift in some of the patterns of migration linked to that, but it's difficult to forecast that.
I think that should also be the motto for health, is to build back better and not repeat what we had before. And I think that we should retain some of the agility, whether it was health workforce, whether it was regulatory agility, policy agility, which we have seen now as something positive coming out of it. But I think, yes, we need to change.
But if I may, Joe,
of course.
We will organize next webinar about COVID mobility and the relationship, because we need to also to understand more. It would be organized in April. I think we need to draw attention on.
Well, that's really good, and I'm glad you mentioned that, Vitanis, that this is part of a series of webinars. This is not just one discussion. This is the second in the series. We're hoping to do one or two more before the summer. Can I ask you a question, Vitanis, while I have you? Why was the death toll so much lower in Eastern and Central European countries than it was, for example, in Britain or Italy or even France? Obviously per 1,000 people, per million or whatever.
No, it's first of all, please keep in mind that our countries are quite different from cultural point of view, social, fabric point of view, and of course from economic development and many reasons. If you can see map of spreading infections through EU. First of all, Italy, then France, Belgium, UK, and so on, and only last wave came into Eastern and Central European part. Of course, because of many reasons, including tourism, including, and of course also people are more or less, I think, more or less depends on like to say, on more coverage of universal, speaking about primary health care and universal health coverage and network of our hospitals and so on. It's heritage from Semashko model from Soviet time. It helps also us to sustain and to have to address those challenges together. And of course we have, for example, in Lithuania, we have high level of hospital beds, we have high level of facilities, and it absorb some pressure on healthcare shortages, and it helped us to reduce number of deaths.
Thank you very much, Achu. I'm going to bring in, if I may, Wolfgang. You had your hand up. You wanted to contribute there, Wolfgang, in Austria.
Yes, well, I'm afraid that we still don't know enough, because Austria is very close to Italy, and we had a very low infection rate during the first wave. But what has been confirmed meanwhile is that in the beginning, many people were treated simply the wrong way through intubation and high pressure ventilation. And the better equipped the healthcare systems were, the more equipment was available, the more people were put on ventilators. And there is an Australian study which came out very recently showing that in Denmark, Netherlands, Belgium, and in France, the death rate from March to April to October went down 8 to 10 folds. And I think this is one of the reasons why the death rates have been so tremendous in the beginning and then changed over the year. But this doesn't, this is one confirmed, I would call it a fact, but I'm sure there are many other reasons why we had so many fatalities in some areas and not to the same extent in other areas.
Well, I think we have run out of time, unfortunately. I wonder if I could pass it back to the chairman of the EIHSD, to Vytenis, to give his closing thoughts on this incredibly interesting discussion and webinar. And I certainly learned a lot. So, Vytenis, if you'd like to say a few words to close the whole thing up.
Okay, thank you, colleagues. First of all, let me congratulate you all and thanks you for your excellent, brilliant presentations and very nice, insights and proposals. I learned a lot, because our goal is finally to find some pan-European solutions. But of course, the EU is for free movement of labor, but the free market do not provide optimal solutions, it's for sure. For me, it's clear. Now we are in very important moment of the development of EU, and it is good to discuss about European Health Union and changes and improvements in the Lisbon Treaty a little bit, especially speaking about situation to allow EU do more, a little bit more in very specific cases, not only in cross-border healthcare threats, but also keeping in mind, for example, rare diseases or rare cancers where no one country can help people to be treated because it is impossible. It's strange view of subsidiarity. We need to understand. We need to empower member states to look more broader picture, not be only nationalistic on healthcare and care system. Of course, public interventions are needed for both national reasons, dealing with medical deserts, and for equity and cohesion between member states. EU is not sum of member states. EU is something more biggest. And we need to understand it's time is speaking about healthcare workforce shortages. Time is to speak about what EU can deliver keeping in mind universal health coverage and providing, guaranteeing access to treatment as human right issue. Good practices are available starting from WHO code and including French practice to deal with medical deserts and private Austrian-American initiative on vocational training of doctors. Very good practice of Open Medicine Institute. I think we need to once again to keep it in mind and to present it in much broader picture. COVID-19 made cooperation in health very demanded. Our time is a window of opportunity for the better, stronger European Health Union, as just Matthias mentioned in the beginning. And mobility is rightful on the agenda of European Health Union. Bold political decisions are needed to strike the balance between labor markets and needed public decisions. I think more or less we can continue in our debates and we can encourage our all partners to think about possibilities to improve European Health Union in more coherent way.
Aichu Vytenis, thank you very much for your time. I'd like to also thank Matthias Wismar, Annette Schrauen, Dominique Polton, Wolfgang Aulitzki, and Algis Dobravolskis, and all of you out there for participating in today's event. Thank you for submitting your questions. Thank you for doing the questionnaire. We will post the detailed results of the questionnaire on the website, eihsd.eu. For now, though, there's certainly a strong sense that people want to discuss the impact of COVID-19 on healthcare and healthcare workers. And as Vytenis already mentioned, we are going to do that next month. It is going to be an important webinar that we will be discussing as part of a series that we're doing on the EIHSD. We will also be putting highlights of this program on the website. But if you want to watch the whole thing again, you just kind of click the link that you used to get to this website. So on behalf of everyone that took part today, and thank you, from me, Joe Lynham, ciao.
And happy Easter for all. Happy Easter.